9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Welcome to the podcast. I am Mark Polymeropoulos, and this is DSR's Above Average Intelligence Show. Today, I am thrilled to welcome as my guest Mr. Ken Dilanian, an NBC News national security reporter based in Washington. He reports for all the network's television and digital platforms and appears regularly on NBC Nightly News, MSNBC shows such as Morning Joe, and others. Previously, he spent 24 years as an award-winning print investigative reporter covering national security for the Associated Press, the LA Times, the USA Today, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Posted for 3 years as a foreign correspondent based in Rome. He also covered Europe and the Middle East and made multiple trips to Iraq to report on the war there, embedded with U.S. troops, and also operating independently from Baghdad. As a local reporter in Philadelphia, Ken won multiple awards for investigations into government dysfunction, including the Casey Medal for Meritorious Journalism for a series on the deaths of children under supervision by Child Protective Services. Ken's a graduate of Williams College with a degree in political science and history, and I am proud to note also Ken is a friend of mine. I will say that openly. He's been to the Vienna Inn many times, one of the great institutions, an old agency hangout, and a place where I certainly meet a lot of my friends and contacts. And I'll just, one quick thing about Ken, I'll embarrass him a little bit here before we start. I think he's a fearless reporter because he's always going after the truth, in particular with such a hyper kind of political environment. Very often, if you say something against one side, you piss people off, and then say something against another. But Ken has always been, in my mind, has that courage, which I think is absolutely critical. And I think it probably reflects a lot of what I go through as well, because I've seemed to piss people off too. Everything I'm doing. Anyway, Ken, welcome to the Above Average Intelligence Show. It's awesome to have you on here. I've tried to get you on a couple times. Scheduling didn't work out, but thank you very much for coming on.
Mark, it's an absolute honor to be here. Thanks for that kind introduction. And what you just said about me, I would throw right back at you. You're in the arena, and you come from an agency where it's inscribed in the lobby, right? Truth is what you're trying to get at, and you're now being criticized by both sides, as you said, for calling it out. So I really admire what you're doing out there, and I have appreciated our friendship. So glad to be here.
Awesome. And one thing, just to let kind of the listeners know, when I made that kind of a decision a while back to say, okay, it'll be interesting to have a kind of a former operations officer come and talk in public. There's been a lot of analysts who've done that in the past. Ken, you certainly helped kind of introduce me to the MSNBC and the NBC family. So I really do appreciate that. But let's start with some current events. And I know, you actually, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, you moved, or you have a dual role now, but you were on the intelligence beat for a long time. Now much more of the Department of Justice beat, which I do want to hear how that went. But let's start off with something that hit the news and is certainly something that I think a lot of Americans are interested in. And that's the continued issue of foreign interference in election campaigns, and in particular, this hack by the Iranian government of the Trump campaign. Give us your overall thoughts on this, and we'll kind of then jump into the details in terms of the U.S. government investigative actions,
right?
The remarkable aspects actually of the Iranian operation, and really what this means. But give us your overall impressions first of what occurred.
So it really does appear that the Iranians have taken a page from what the Russians did in 2016. It's a classic hack and leak and attempted dump operation, right? But what's so different is the way it's, first of all, they weren't as successful, it appears, in getting interesting stuff, and then the reaction of the U.S. government. But so just to back up, it appears that Iranian government actors, and now we know from the indictment that was just released last week or on Friday, that these are IRGC hackers, essentially. And this is an operation that the U.S. government says has been going on for years, and hacking, including a former deputy CIA director, former DOD official, and several journalists. But this year they switched to targeting the campaigns, and they've targeted both the Biden and the Trump campaigns. And apparently they got in to some Trump accounts and stole some documents, including a dossier of sort of internal opposition research on J.D. Vance, the kind of thing that a campaign would do. Hey, we're looking at this guy for vice president. What are his vulnerabilities? What has he said in the public record? And before this was exposed as Iran, they were shopping this around to various media organizations. But the U.S. government very quickly said, hey, this is Iran. They called it out. And the media organizations have not, with one exception, have not published any of this information. Now, part of that, I think, is because it's not very interesting and newsworthy. If there was something really sensational, it might be a harder decision. But part of it also is, none of us want to play into the hands of a foreign intelligence operation. In 2016, when the Russians hacked the Democrats and stole all those emails, the media was publishing it before we even realized what was going on. And then even after we realized what was going on, this ship has sailed, right? It was too late. And there wasn't a lot of thought given to the fact that we were playing into the hands of Russia. That is one of the things that's different here. This stuff, for the most part, hasn't been published. And the Iranians also apparently offered it to members of the Biden campaign through email. And what the FBI said on Friday is there's no evidence that anybody on the Biden-Harris campaign even replied to those emails.
So, there's a couple of things to kind of unpack there. One is I do think that the media was more responsible. You didn't, except one individual, one journalist who I think who did publish and got fired, or at least he's been suspended. He's suspended on X, if that means anything. But there is the note. I mean, look, this is in terms of J.D. Vance, like he's talking about eating cats and dogs. So I'm not sure what more can you get in terms of.
Right.
And all of his comments in the past on Trump have been, kind of well documented. But I do think there's a sense of responsibility here, and I think that's a good thing. And I do hope that the Biden campaign did kind of reject this. But it does go. And I guess the question for you as a journalist and journalistic ethics. So where, as you're sitting in the newsroom, and I'm sure you have this conversation with colleagues. So if you get information from a source, from one of our adversaries, what do you do with it? It's a very fair question, and I'm sure it's one that's debated, and it's probably dynamic. It's fluid, the way even your editors and your bosses would deal with this.
Yeah, and I'll just give you my opinion on it. It's that these decisions go way over my pay grade. But look, as journalists, we are all the time getting information from sources with a bias, with an axe to grind, and that doesn't mean we don't use it, right? We just evaluate. First of all, the truth of the material. That's the most important thing. Is it true? Is it accurate? And then, what are the sources' motivations? And can we triangulate and go to people with different motivations? In the case of, that's one conversation. The bar is much higher when you're talking about a foreign adversary. But I do think, look, if there was something deeply significant, deeply newsworthy, for example, a recording of one of the candidates, well, in this case, it would be one of the candidates, uttering a racial slur on a TV show that he used to be on, for example, the long lost Apprentice recording, and some foreign adversary had dug that up. And I think that would be a much harder decision. And I don't see really how you would withhold that, something so significant that the American public, arguably needs to know about, even if it came from a foreign adversary. But I think the bar is much higher. Because you are playing into the hands of foreign adversaries who, the government is now saying very clearly, Russia, China, and Iran, they are all trying to interfere in the presidential campaign. They're trying to influence American public opinion with covert propaganda operations. And the government's reaction is much different from 2016. In 2016, this all played out. They didn't tell us until much later that it was the Russians and they did it. They didn't even react really in real time. Now they're having monthly briefings from the ODNI. They're bringing reporters in saying, here's what we're seeing. The DOJ has now put out the second of two indictments. The first one was RT and the Russian operation. Really, and they do that knowing they're not going to get these people. They're in Russia and they're in Iran. Right. The main reason they do it is to get the information out to the public. It's easier to put it in an indictment than for the CIA to declassify, their own reporting. And they spell it out, and it's all in the public record, and everyone can see what's going on. And they hope that in some way can inoculate, the American public from this.
You think about in the past, I think the DOJ has gotten in trouble. Of course, it's the famous, what was it with Jim Comey and the Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
What was it? A letter he wrote just before the campaign.
Reopening the email investigation in October. Yeah.
So it seems to me, though, they learned from that a bit, and you covered the Justice Department, but in things like this now, there's this, I think, a fairly ridiculous notion of the deep state and a weaponized political system. But look, the Department of Justice seems to have done a very good job here in uncovering, Iranian attempts to obviously go after the Trump campaign. And so, to me, that's actually a good thing. It shows that there are, and I believe this, there are nonpartisan officials there, and that they just want to do the right thing. And they're struggling with, of course, this incredible issue of foreign interference in our elections.
Yeah, and you know very well that it wasn't just them, right? A lot of this information came from the intelligence community. Right. And I'll tell you what, they're facing a dilemma now because they are approaching what they call their quiet period, where they don't do anything. They don't do interviews, before the election. I interviewed last week Matt Olson, the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, and that's probably the last. And he talked about foreign interference, and that's probably the last interview he's going to give. But at the same time, somebody has to call this stuff out right up until election day. I mean, 48 hours before the election is the most dangerous time, right? If there's some AI video saying that there's a bomb in a polling place in some swing state that causes people to stay away from the polls, that could swing the election. And, there's real question, I think, as to which part of the U.S. government is going to, if any, is going to get out there and say, hey, that's false. That is a foreign, AI manipulated video. Is it the ODNI? Is it the FBI? It's really not clear right now. That concerns me.
You almost need almost a 24/7 war room environment to combat this.
Yeah.
Particularly in these times. And I do worry sometimes that we almost become desensitized to this notion of foreign government interference. Oh, our adversaries are just doing this because they're doing this so often. But I was glad to see that the DOJ took action. I agree with you. Clearly, this is based on some intelligence collection. Yeah. And there must have been a pretty robust process between the intelligence community and DOJ in terms of protecting sources and methods on this.
Right.
Well.
And remember, when the Mueller team did that indictment of the Russians and GRU hackers back in 2016, they also had a lot of intelligence information there. And we were all surprised at the time. We had never really seen that before, an indictment that clearly was the fruits of intelligence and NSA collection, exposing all these GRU hackers and how they did it. And foreign governments helped, the Dutch or whatever. Now it's become a matter of course, like they're doing these. And there must be as you said, a robust effort of cooperation between the agencies. They can get it out fast because they realize they gotta alert the public to this stuff.
Correct. Let's switch topics just a bit to another pretty controversial, I think subject in which there is some bipartisan interest and support in terms of reform, and that's the Secret Service. An organization in my career I work with very closely. Obviously, on when I'm posted at embassies abroad, we'd have multiple presidential and vice presidential visits. So you'd have Secret Service advance teams. So you get to know the Secret Service agents. They are overextended. They do bust their butts. Those on the detail work kind of brutal hours. But it is clear that there is something wrong. With the Secret Service now, with not only kind of these assassination, well, of course, the first Trump assassination attempt. But we just saw another scandal break where there was a member of, I guess, or a campaign staffer who has lodged a complaint against a Secret Service agent for sexual harassment. And so, these are things compounded one after another. The Secret Service former director has resigned. But I guess, so give me a sense of overall, your thoughts on the Secret Service. What are they doing right, not right? Are they overextended? And also, just there is a notion I hear out there. Look, they have to get back really to their original roots, which is just the kind of the protection part of this, and they do a lot of other things too, in terms of counterfeiting and things like that. But this is a tough job, but they got to get it right, and it doesn't seem like they are right now. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with a disclaimer. I am not an expert on the Secret Service. It's not really part of my beat. So I'm talking more as an analyst. I've obviously been reporting on these stories and reading the various investigations, and it's just been damning. I mean, and obviously there's a whole history of Secret Service scandals, right? The whole escapades in Cartagena with prostitutes, and so this isn't, and then the guy who ran in the White House. So this is obviously not the first time the Secret Service is coming under this kind of scrutiny, but it really does appear. I mean, this was about as colossal a failure, what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania, as you can imagine. I mean, they have one job, right? And they didn't do it. They didn't.
Right.
They didn't secure a roof where a sniper was able to get up and take a shot at the president, former president, a clear line of sight. And the latest investigation from the Senate released last week just shows that it's worse than you could have imagined. Like, and the Secret Service agents who they dragged before their committee and put under oath, they all pointed fingers apparently, and no one was responsible, no one's in charge. It really raises fundamental questions about what's happening at the agency. You've heard people say, well, they're never tested. There hasn't been anything like this for decades, and so whereas if you're in the military or the special operations community, or if you're in the police, you are regularly going out and encountering hostile actors, and these guys almost never do, right? Or never do, really. There hasn't been a shot at the president, and so that may be part of what's going on here. That some complacency set in, but clearly there's some systemic issues. And you mentioned, like, they do all this other stuff. They do counterfeiting and they do cyber investigations,
Right.
And yet they're saying they don't have the manpower to fulfill their protective missions. Well, the FBI can take over the counterfeiting stuff. Like,
Right.
Why is this hard? Like, just devote all your people to the protective mission. So yeah, it's kind of a disaster. And what's interesting is, the director, the Kimberly Cheadle, resigned after a very poor showing on the Hill where she didn't answer any questions. So her deputy has taken over, Ronald Rowe, as the acting director. Well, he was the acting director when all this bad stuff, he was the deputy director when all this bad stuff happened. I'm sort of wondering, as an outside observer, how he is kind of, skating by. And he's right out of central casting. He's very good in speeches on the Hill. He had a very forceful news conference the other day. He's trying to own and take ownership of the failure. But I think it's only a matter of time before questions start to be asked. Well, you were in the line of, you were in the chain of command too. How did this happen on your watch? So it's really it's not a good situation.
And there is something to be said again for the bipartisan nature of, I think, the investigations and the calls for additional funding. And President Biden also called for additional funding as well. And I do sympathize. I think about it almost as a soccer goalie. Like, they can't let a goal in.
Right.
They have to pitch a shutout every single time. I'm getting my soccer nomenclature wrong. We need some Roger Bennett, from on this. But it's a very tough job, and so I do have some sympathy.
It's a zero fail mission, but it's interesting. Like the Butler thing was an abject failure. The golf course thing, it's a little less clear. Some people are saying, "Oh, how did this guy get so close? That's a failure." But the Secret Service's view is, look, we can't clear that golf course. It's not. There are public roads all around it. As long as Trump's going to play golf, he's taking some risk, and the system worked, is what they're saying. We were ahead of him one hole. We saw the guy with the gun. We got him, right? So, and I think that's fair. I mean, you can criticize it, but like in that case, so we know that things are going to happen. I think if there was some super imaginative plot with a drone or something that they couldn't possibly have predicted, they wouldn't be getting all this heat. But what happened in Butler was some disturbed person with no military training was able to get a shot at the former president. That is just unacceptable.
All right, Ken, I think let's move on to another subject that I think I'm going to bring you back in your life journey as a journalist. You and I talked a while back that I would go back and forth over the last couple of years to Philadelphia to cover the Philly Police Department, and I do a lot of leadership teaching there for them. It's been really rewarding. But you spent time in Philly, and I think when I texted you after a last trip, I was like, "Hey, I'm at the Philadelphia headquarters." You're like, "Hey, that's the old Inquirer building, where you used to work." But I do want to ask you this because I'm always interested, talking to guests about kind of their journey. And we don't have to go back to your time at Williams, but talk to, was Philadelphia this? And you won a lot of awards there, but was Philadelphia kind of a seminal portion of your career where you really learned a lot about journalism? You're covering the local beat, you're dealing with the cops, and you're dealing with the mayor and a wildly corrupt city government. What was that like?
Well, it's also the story of American journalism, right? I graduated from college in 1991, and actually my first job was at the Inquirer, but it was almost like a 2-year internship covering the suburbs, local governments. But when I arrived there, that newspaper was a force of journalism. They had won a Pulitzer for 17 years in a row under this legendary editor. they had foreign bureaus all over the world, Beijing, Moscow, South
Amazing.
America. They had national bureaus, Chicago, LA. They had hundreds and hundreds of reporters covering every part of not only the city of Philadelphia, but the suburbs around. It was incredible. And that was a time when newspapers were thriving. There were monopolies in their own market. It was before the internet. And there were amazing writers at that newspaper. It was the baby boomers who were inspired to go into journalism by Watergate. And I learned at the feet of these people, and it was incredible. And then after those 2 years, I went and worked in Texas for a while and smaller papers and covered, death penalty cases and local cops and courts, and then came back to Philly and covered first the State House in Harrisburg, which was an incredible thing. Anybody who works in Washington should first cover a state capitol because it teaches you how government works.
Well, everyone gets arrested there too and goes to jail.
I literally like four of the House and Senate leaders that I covered ended up in prison. 2 of them roomed together. The Republican and the Democratic leader of the House at the time ended up roommates in prison.
That's incredible.
And when I was covering City Hall, the FBI planted a bug in the mayor's office. I mean, and they didn't get anything because the mayor's son happened to be a police officer, and somehow the bug got discovered before he said anything intimidating. So it was, and then I was the last foreign correspondent at that newspaper. And they sent me to Rome. Why Rome? Well, at the time they had somebody in London, and they had this job was open. It was on the books, and then I ended up covering the Iraq War and being embedded. And then when I left that job after 3 years, that they never had a foreign correspondent again, and now they can barely cover, their own City Hall and news. The whole economics of that business has changed. But in terms of the journalism, it was a great way to learn, it was a long time before I got to Washington. But, nowadays you see 25-year-old kids covering Congress for Politico. It didn't work that way back then. You had to work your way up, and you made your mistakes in the local market, and that was kind of a good thing, which I think is missing today.
So I will embarrass you a little bit. So, I mean, you are a star now in terms of the media. No, I mean, you were one of the key journalists for NBC, for MSNBC. But I wonder, are there times where you think back to those days in Philly? Because and I think about my career at CIA. Like when I was a young case officer, was the most fun time. I was too stupid to know anything, big picture stuff and the politics of the agency. For you, the politics of the newsroom. Do you look back in those times and say, "Man, that was fun. I missed that."
It was so much fun. And when you're doing meaningful investigations, like you mentioned that award that we won for the story about the dead kids in Philly. I mean, it's a grim subject, but I worked with a reporting partner on that who's now at ProPublica. He's a good friend of mine. And we worked, 12 hours a day on this because we were running around and we were exposing like really awful behavior that was secret because all these child files were supposed to be confidential. We figured out ways to get at them. And the agency was covering up the fact that all these kids were dying under their supervision of horrific abuse. And, I'll never forget the day that we were about to publish that story, and I had to go get comment from the mayor at City Hall, John Street at the time. And it was just, the feeling like this kind of triumph that the Philadelphia Inquirer was the only game in town. They were the big fish. And when they wrote a story, it had huge implications. In Washington, obviously, even though NBC is a colossus, there's no one media organization that has that kind of influence and can set the agenda. So I miss it. It was a lot of fun.
I love that. I love that. And so, people's life journey always intrigues me. And so I would imagine that, if you have the opportunity to talk to young journalists, you probably talk about those days as well in terms of giving back. Before we get to the bonus contact, one last question for you. And I think it's just a natural one because you have switched over a bit from the intelligence beat to DOJ. How is it different? Is it perhaps more kind of long form reporting? I mean, the intelligence beat under the Trump administration was insane. You were breaking stories every day. There's, half of not the intelligence community, half the White House was leaking stuff to you all because they were horrified at what they were seeing. And now you go to it's a critical beat, particularly with covering the Supreme Court. But I would imagine it's much a different pace. You can maybe do some more long form stories, but what's the difference between the two?
There's two things with me, right? I started covering the intelligence community for newspapers for the LA Times, and I moved to the AP. And then I went to TV, and covering intelligence for TV is much different from print because there aren't a lot of pictures in the intelligence in intelligence stories. You can have the best scoop in the world. Like, remember when the New York Times broke the story about all those CIA assets in China mysteriously disappearing? What a scoop that was. It didn't get on nightly news because there are no pictures, right? Like, so that is the fundamental problem with TV and intelligence. And no, the DOJ beat is actually busier. And TV in general is busier. Like I cover, it's more of a day-to-day run and gun kind of thing where I'm having to do live shots one day on one story and the next day on a different story. And there's very little time for long form. Whereas the intelligence beat is particularly for print. You are spending weeks at a time digging into stuff, and you're meeting with people constantly and finding people like you who just retired and are willing to talk, because basically if you're in the CIA, you're not talking to reporters unless you
Yeah, you have a polygraph exam take. You get fired.
It's an entirely investigative beat in the sense that it's all about things that some people don't want you to know. And it's all about people who are not supposed to talk to you. And that's less true of the DOJ world, although it's true of the FBI to a certain extent, particularly these days. The FBI used to be more free with talking to journalists, and they had some leak scandals, and now they're very buttoned up, and it's harder.
Okay, so it's the opposite then. So this is more kind of fast paced, less long form. Interesting. And what about covering the Supreme Court?
I don't do that actually.
Like? I see you in front of there, though. But
so it's weird. So Laura Jarrett, for us, who's our chief legal analyst, she works in New York.
Right.
She is the Supreme Court reporter, and then we have a digital guy who came from Reuters who covers the Supreme Court. I do live shot. I'm like the backup because she's on the network and I'm doing MS. So I don't. But I do cover to the extent that I listen to arguments and report on it on MSNBC. But I don't like Pete Williams, my predecessor in this job. He actually covered the Supreme Court in depth, but I don't really do that.
So you're playing a lawyer on TV, is what you're saying. Look, unfortunately, this is all that. This is where the point in the podcast where we have to say goodbye to our guests who are not yet subscribers. If you want to listen to the rest of the pod and to all other shows in full, just go to the DSRnetwork.com and click on membership. It's only $7 a month, and it brings you a lot of great bonus content. If you're not a subscriber, we hope you will be one soon. And if you are, please stand by. We'll be right back in a moment.